Civilization III was one of the most defining games of my childhood, not only because it made me into an avid fan of the strategy genre, but also how it shaped the way that I would look at every 4X game going forward. This 2001 classic represents the absolute foundation of the current turn-based nation builder in a way that makes it almost impossible for me to resist comparing our modern options to the original. Still, Civ 3 certainly has its flaws, among which its dated UI, convoluted mechanical explanations, and an equally barbaric yet competent AI can make the game frustrating for new players. This probably isn't the best game to dip your toes in the strategy genre for the first time, but it does still hold a certain retro charm to it that might appeal to certain people more interested in the systems and rules that create the building blocks behind these games. Developing a true understanding how Civ 3 works is the fundamental journey behind the game, in a similar way to how players might follow a JRPG for the storyline or a Diablo clone for the gear progression. So if you're one of those players that views an in-depth mechanical analysis for strategy games like it might be the moral equivalent to spoiling a Marvel movie, then you might want to leave now. But for those of you that are looking at the graphics like some type of insurmountable wall for your enjoyment, then this might just be a way to experience a true classic without putting in the time or the effort yourself. After all, my name is JBJett, and I want to take you on a journey through every aspect of this strategic masterpiece that somehow found a way to worm itself into my favorite games of 2021, a Civilization III critique. Now, before I get too far into the video, I have to acknowledge the fact that the gameplay recording is in 1280 by 720, which does happen to be a significant downgrade from the typical 1080p that most YouTube videos use. However, if I were to take Civ 3 and try putting it in 1960 by 1080 like I usually play on, then weird things start to happen. The UI doesn't increase in size, instead shrinking into the far corners of the screen, while the field of view on the actual map gets expanded tenfold. No matter how much you might try to use the mouse wheel to scroll in and out, it does nothing, since the game also happens to be designed in 2D with some interesting artistic choices that make it look 3D. The view of the map zooms out on higher resolutions because the actual sprites they developed to represent all the assets are stuck at one specific size that looks perfectly normal on 720p and pretty small on 1080p. Also, there's the fact that even if the game is set to 1080p, whenever you click on a city, the screen is going to cut off the sides with a black bar in order to try and display the normal UI, because it was never designed to know how to upscale the menus for the game. So I guess it is theoretically possible to play the game in 1080p if that's really important to you, but the classic 1280 by 720 allowed me to see a lot better sense of detail on the screen, so that's just the way I preferred to play. Unfortunately, this also made the visual quality of the recordings I took suffer as a result, for which I can only really apologize and give my reasons why. Of course, this is also assuming you're playing on the current Steam version of the game called Civilization III Complete, which also comes with the 2 expansions, Play the World and Conquests. The bad side of this version of the game is that it also means that new players are stuck with all the changes these expansions made to the game, which can have some severe effects on the general balance of certain units. I'll go more in detail on those problems later, but at least there's a way to easily purchase and download Civ 3 today with only the minimal bugs that come from running a 20-year-old game on modern hardware. The next thing I have to mention is the fact that the critique is coming from the point of view of someone who can beat the game on deity difficulty, which is currently the second hardest difficulty in the game. If you read some articles from a player who typically plays on the settings that don't give many advantages to the AI, their experience with Civ 3 is going to be very different from my own, just like your opinions might be very different if you boot up the game for the first time later this day. It doesn't necessarily take long to get good at the game, since it took me a total of 84 hours and maybe 20 matches in total to go from losing several matches on the lowest settings to winning my first deity game, but It does take a bit of research on the side to figure out the little things that Civ 3 doesn't really make clear through the in-game descriptions. Merely by watching this critique or any of the tutorials for Civ 3 that a creator named Suede has put out, you'll already be much closer to beating the game on deity, since learning about the mechanics is more than half the battle when it comes to Civ 3. So for those of you that have never seen a civilization game before, you set up some map settings for a new world, choose a civilization to control and the difficulty settings, then start out with a settler and a worker or some other units depending on which advanced settings you ticked on the start screen. The settler is used to found a new city, which will start with a population of 1, who will work the tiles directly around your capital. Each of these tiles has some associated values attached to it, like shields, which are used to create units and buildings, food, which is used to grow new population points to work more tiles, and commerce, which is used to make trade deals with other nations and research new technologies. Obviously, some tiles will have better yields than others, like how grasslands will typically provide 2 food, while plains tiles and hills tiles will provide 1 food and 1 shield. These base settings for each tile can then be added to by certain factors, like the fact that any tiles touching a river will gain 1 commerce, or resources like a cow can increase the tile yield by 2 food and 1 shield, making a grassland tile give 4 food and 1 shield by adding both values together. The player can then use the worker unit to improve these tiles even more by building a mine to increase the yield by 1 shield, irrigating near rivers to increase the tile by 1 food, or building a road which increases commerce by 1. Now, food is important because it will allow your cities to grow additional population points, who can then work more tiles around the city and provide more shields and commerce to the civilization. Shields are important since you need to use them to build units like the spearmen to defend your cities, swordsmen to go attack your enemies, and buildings that will increase the productivity of the city you build them in. Finally, commerce is important since you need gold to afford a standing army and the maintenance cost on buildings, or you can use your gold to fund your research on new technologies and make your people happy using the research and luxury sliders in the government screen. In addition to this government screen, which allows you to see a general view of how your empire is doing, each advisor has an associated information screen that will help you guide your growing nation. The military screen will allow you to compare your strength to your enemies. The diplomacy screen will allow you to see who's in an alliance with other nations, as well as an easy way to get into contact with those nations. And the trade screen helps you to keep track of which strategic resources you have access to and what you're currently trading away. Perhaps the most important option is the technology tree, which shows you the general layout of which advances will lead to further techs, as well as what those technologies will actually allow you to do. Once you complete each tech in a given era that doesn't have a small X in the top corner of the box, you will advance to the next era and earn the ability to research more and more powerful options. The end result of which may lead you to build a spaceship, which serves as one of the several victory conditions for the game. Your other options for victory include Conquest, where you kill every other nation on the map, Domination, where you own 66% of the world landmass and 66% of the world's population, Culture, where you get a single city to 20k culture points by filling it with buildings like libraries and temples that earn culture each turn and slowly expand the borders of that city. Diplomacy, where the owner of a building called the United Nations can hold an election for the chairman of the board, who will win the game if they get the majority vote by the other nations. And finally, the score-based victory, which will trigger after a given number of turns and award the win to whoever has the highest score at the end of the game. That covers most of the basic concepts you need to know in order to dive into your first game, but it's not going to be enough for even intermediate players to start learning new things. At this point, you might notice that the population points that you were building up in your cities actually have emotions. Who would have thought? So if the number of unhappy citizens ever gets larger than the number of happy citizens, that city will riot and stop producing any commerce or shields until you find a way to make more of them happy again. This is done by either placing military police units in the city that will provide one happy face for each unit you have stationed in the area, or by spending commerce on the luxury slider that will turn one commerce per turn into a happy face. As you expand your nation, you'll eventually acquire a couple luxury resources like incense, furs, and gems that will also translate into one happy face if you can connect that resource to the city with roads, so this gives players a reason to expand as fast as they can. To power this expansion, any city that you have can spend 30 shields and 2 population points to build a settler that can move around the map and found another city, giving you culture control of the 8 adjacent tiles around that square. You'll often want to do this to gain control of the valuable luxury resources, but also some strategic resources like iron and horses, which allow you to build more powerful military units like the swordsman and the chariot. What's interesting about this initial expansion phase to the game is that you won't be able to see every single resource at the beginning of a match until you unlock some particular technologies like ironworking and gunpowder later in the game. As such, the map will probably be filled with several cities belonging to every nation by the time the late game resources are even unlocked, forcing the player to either get lucky and already own those resources in their borders, or go to war with their neighbors to take the resources for themselves. So as you quickly expand your nation by founding your own cities or taking your enemy's territory, you might start to notice the corruption feature that makes further expansion less efficient over time. After a certain number of cities belong to a nation, you will start losing 10% of your commerce and shields to corruption, then 20%, then 30%, and so on until you eventually hit something close to 90% corruption as you span the entire globe. This value will depend on a city-by-city basis, since it's both determined by the overall number of cities you have, but also the distance a city has from your capital. Mind you, even though this sounds like a really bad thing, it will still almost always be worth having more cities than less cities. Civ 3 rewards players for heavy expansion, and while the corruption feature might make new cities less efficient over time, there are several ways to work around this feature by investing in certain buildings like the courthouse that decrease corruption, or choosing certain governments that suffer less corruption in total. This may reduce certain cities into a shambling mess that struggled to build even a single unit in less than 80 turns, but those cities are still expanding your borders and providing access to resources, taking control away from your opponents, and providing 1 shield per turn, which is better than the 0 shields per turn if you didn't have that city. I've just mentioned governments as an opportunity to reduce the general corruption of your empire, and this feature might also be one of the most game-defining options that shape the direction of your nation. Every player starts each match in a government called despotism, which suffers under heavy corruption and allows players to station up to 2 units in each city for military police happiness. But the most important feature of despotism is the fact that it will reduce the yield on every tile with a value above 2. So if a tile has a yield of 3 food, you will only earn 2 food for working that tile. Or if you have a grasslands cow that would normally have a yield of 4 food, 1 shield, that will be reduced to 3 food, 1 shield, limiting your productivity by 1 unit as long as you are above the soft cap of 2. Of course, this will encourage players to try and switch out of despotism as soon as possible, regardless of the fact that this might cost them a couple turns of anarchy. This anarchy phase as you switch between governments will last between 2 to 8 turns depending on how large your nation is, and will cause every city you own to stop producing shields or commerce for that period of time, as well as reducing the efficiency of your workers by half. Despite this, it's still worth taking several turns of anarchy to get out of despotism and start using either the monarchy or republic governments that you will be able to unlock near the end of the ancient era. Monarchy is the easiest one to use out of the two, since it gives every city a healthy unit support value that will allow you to avoid paying maintenance costs on any of the units you own up until a certain cap. In addition to this, monarchy allows players to whip population points to hurry the production queue, gets rid of the despotism penalty to tile yields, and allows you to place up to 3 military police units in each city. It is just a straight up improvement from despotism in every single way, and will be the most likely government that you'll want to use while playing a warmonger focused game. The other option of Republic is a bit more nuanced in that it comes with both some downsides as well as some of the strongest benefits in the entire game. Of course, Republic gets rid of the despotism penalty, but it also removes the ability to use military police to keep your citizens happy, so players will have to use other tools in their stead. In addition to this, a Republic player will get a lower unit support cap for each city they have under a certain population value, making it harder to support a large army in the early game until you can get your cities above size 6 and eventually size 12 near the end of the match. Republic will also cause your citizens to suffer war weariness, where your population will start to get more and more unhappy the longer you spend in a war, eventually forcing many of your cities into open riots if you can't close out a war within a reasonable period of time. This government really wants you to know that it's probably not the best choice for going to war, so it will also double the cost of every single unit that you have over your unit support value. The benefit to all of this? You get the option to spend gold to hurry a production queue, but more importantly, every tile that already yields at least 1 commerce will have an additional 1 commerce added to that value. This sounds stupidly unimportant, but when you take into account that the only tiles that naturally produce commerce in the game are rivers and water tiles, this starts to make it a big deal. A road improvement can increase the commerce of every land tile by 1, which then picks up the Republic bonus to currency, increasing the commerce to 2 per tile. As such, the Republic bonus to commerce is going to literally double the amount of money you can make on around 80% of the tiles in your empire, while most water tiles are still experiencing a 50% increase to efficiency under this system. This effect is so amazingly good that it single-handedly makes the Republic government one of the most powerful options in the entire game, regardless of all those penalties I listed off before. Learning how to work around all the negatives while making the most of the positives a Republic brings is in fact the one skill that I think will allow most players to beat the game on the hardest difficulties. Learning how to avoid wars and being able to win any wars you're forced into with a smaller military than your enemy will allow players that sit in a Republic from the moment they unlock the option to either out-tech their opponents or simply buy the world through trade deals. And yet most players will never even bother to try the government in the first place, since if you try to read the in-game encyclopedia about the game systems, Republic just looks like an inferior option to monarchy in almost every single way. I think this highlights just how difficult it can be to learn to play Civ 3, since the in-game tooltips are pretty abysmal. The corruption stat under despotism is described as rampant. Under monarchy, they use the word problematic, and under Republic, the word is nuisance. Now, I don't know about you, but I would never think that those words equate to 50% increased distance corruption under despotism, standard corruption rules under monarchy, and a 10% decrease to corruption under Republic. Just like the fact that the Republic commerce bonus is only even mentioned in the flavor text for its description. You would think that a +1 commerce per tile would be a pretty big deal to talk about, but the game will never actually go through the effort of letting you know that it's even a feature. Half of the difficulty in playing old games is the fact that they might not even tell you half the rules you're trying to play by. So as we start to delve into the later governments in the tech tree, the options start to become just a little bit more specialized. The Conquests expansion added the feudalism government that comes early in the medieval era and basically serves as a modified version of monarchy. You get higher unit support for smaller cities and lower unit support for larger cities, making this government somewhat specialized for a player that wants to whip out a lot of units from cities to keep their population count low and help fuel a war of attrition. An incredibly unique scenario to be sure, and in basically every circumstance other than a very strange game setup, you would prefer to be in a monarchy even as a warmonger. The next option that unlocks is a more specialized version of Republic called Democracy, which enhances both the positives and the negatives. You get 0 unit support from cities of any size, and war weariness is increased substantially, so any wars you get into under Democracy are really gonna hurt your development. On the bright side, you do get a 25% reduced distance corruption on top of the normal 10% reduction to corruption from Republic, a 50% increase to worker speed, as well as the opportunity to draft one defensive troop per turn, although this draft option requires a city to be above size 7 and will turn a citizen from your nationality into a specialized low health defensive unit depending on what technologies you currently have unlocked. Situationally useful if you find yourself with enemy forces behind your back lines, but given the fact that this is the government with the highest war penalties in the game, you're gonna want to stay out of that situation in the first place. Like with the situational nature of the feudalism government, the benefits of democracy typically don't outweigh the negatives. There's no consistent way to avoid war entirely in this game short of just good luck, so the lack of unit support kind of punishes players if they want any hope of being able to defend themselves. On top of this, if you do get into a war, the war weariness will quickly cripple your nation, forcing players to either eat several turns of anarchy to get out of the government in the first place, or suffer through the riots in every city at once while hoping you can ask for peace as soon as possible. Even the worker bonus starts to seem counterproductive when you realize that workers count against your unit support cap, so every worker you have under this government is also costing the player 1 gold per turn. In most cases, you're just straight up better off sticking with the Republic. The final two governments are unlocked halfway through the Industrial Age and both serve a more military-focused playstyle. Under communism, the unit support values are decent for every type of city, and you can draft up to 2 conscripts per turn, but the real reason why you might want communism is for the corruption effects. Using this government, every single city suffers the same distance value for corruption reasons, causing your core cities to become more corrupt and your more distant cities to become less corrupt. Ultimately, this will result in a net increase for shield production across your entire nation, but it will also make those helplessly corrupt cities that you might have inherited over a couple of wars into actually productive cogs in the larger empire. Under communism, you won't have the same megacities that can pump out units every 2 or 3 turns near your capital, but you also get a lot more flexibility when it comes to the outlier parts of your empire, with new additions becoming efficient much earlier than they would under a more centralized government style. If you've already conquered 2 or 3 nations by this point in the game, communism is a decent late game option to start using all that land you've developed against future enemies in order to close out the match. Fascism, on the other hand, kind of just sucks. When a nation switches to fascism, every single city will lose between 1 to 3 population points depending on the size of that city, and whenever you take an enemy city, you won't be able to start building up culture in that area until your national citizens outnumber the foreign citizens in that city. The draft rate is the same as it is under communism. You get the same 10% reduction to corruption that Republic gets, and I guess your workers get a 100% speed bonus to any improvements they build, except that by this time in the game you've probably come close to the point where your workers will start running out of tiles to improve with roads, mines, and irrigation. Under fascism, you could theoretically get a higher unit support count than any other government, since their unit support for metropolises is the highest in the game at 10 per city for those over 12 population, but you're also going to have to work your way back up to that, since every metropolis in the nation just lost 3 population points as a result of the switch into fascism. Unfortunately, communism also supports 6 units per city of any size when you'll probably be inheriting a bunch of low population cities, since the late game warfare meta encourages players to literally bomb enemy cities into the ground. So you're about to get a lot of 1 or 2 pop cities in the late game. I guess fascism is at least historically accurate in the fact that it's only useful in a small number of very unique situations, and everyone pretty much hates it. Sounds about right. But that's about it when it comes to the Civ 3 governments, and we've already started to dip our toes into the more advanced aspects of the game, so it's about time I started to talk about wonders. Depending on which civilization you chose at the start of the match, you might even have access to a wonder on the first turn of the game. These mega buildings are available on a 1 per match basis, where the player that gets there first gets a significant bonus and everyone else has to switch their production investment into something else. Mind you, this production investment can be significant, from 200 shields for the cheaper wonders to 1,000 shields near the end of the game. As such, if several players are competing for the same wonder and one of them finishes it first, the other players will most likely switch the shields they invested into another wonder, or in the case that they don't have any other options, an expensive building or unit with the surplus shields going to waste. This ends up resulting in an interesting circumstance where several AI will all seem to complete a different wonder on the same turn, because what's actually happening is that they were all competing for the same wonder, then switching off to the next most expensive one when they lost the initial race. After all, there's a good reason why all the AI will be competing for these wonders, since the bonuses can be pretty powerful. Copernicus's observatory doubles the research produced from a single city, while the pyramids gives every single city on the continent a free granary. Most of the wonders are worth the shield investment, but also incredibly specialized for different playstyles. Sun Tzu's Art of War will provide a free barracks in every city, but that might not be as important for a more peaceful focused player compared to a warmonger. Meanwhile, the Great Library will give the owner every technology for free that is known by at least 2 other players, which ironically benefits a player with lower research speed than your opponents more than the player that's ahead of the curve. These wonders can be so powerful under the right circumstances that many strategies for the game revolve almost entirely around the acquisition of certain wonders at any cost. For the most part, players can use a couple of key techniques to guarantee the ability to produce at least 1 or 2 specific wonders per game, unless you're just helplessly behind the tech curve for some reason. The obvious thing to do is simply beeline your research for the technology that locks the wonder that you want to build, and then refuse to trade away that technology to other players, except that this strategy typically won't work against the harder AI that have a better tech speed than you do. Instead, many players use the fact that you can switch the shield investment from one project into another project without losing those shields in the exchange, allowing them to get a head start on the opponent. This technique would end up getting taken out of later Civilization games because it was almost necessary to use this system to beat the AI to the wonders you really wanted, especially in the early game. So while I'm talking about production mechanics in general, I also need to mention the fact that surplus shields on any individual build will also be lost instead of carrying over into the next project. So if you need 5 more shields to produce a settler and your city produces 7 shields per turn, then the 2 shields that weren't used on the settler will go to waste at the end of the turn, giving players yet another mechanic to micromanage if they so choose. This is one of those small things that I never had to bother with, even on the harder difficulty settings for the game, but it's worth noting for anyone that wants to get really competitive with Civ 3. Now, I've put off talking about buildings in too much detail up until this point in the critique because it's kind of hard to appreciate how to use them without the full context of everything else. Buildings like the library and the bank are pretty easy to understand since they increase the value of every commerce spent on research and currency by 50% respectively. Otherwise, more situational buildings like the temple will increase your happiness by 1, or the granary, which will save half of the food you spend on each population increase. I say they're situational because in most cases you're better off using the luxury slider in order to create happiness instead of spending the shield cost on the temple in addition to the same 1 gold per turn that you would pay for the luxury slider. Likewise, the granary can pay off in spades if you build it early enough in a city's lifespan, as you get the food savings on population point after population point over time. But you also have to factor in if you'd rather spend that production on something else early on, like getting out another settler to go tag that key resource that you really need, or a couple units for an early game rush. Buildings can start to get really complicated when it comes to their true worth, since every building also comes with an associated maintenance cost in gold per turn, although there are still a couple of things that you'll want no matter what. Every single city is going to need a marketplace at some point in time, since it not only increases the gold production by 50%, but it also increases the effectiveness of every additional luxury you have access to. With a market, 3 luxuries provide 4 happy faces, 4 luxuries provide 6 happy faces, 5 lux for 9 happy faces, and so on, basically solving your happiness needs in larger cities as long as you have a marketplace in the area and trade for a couple of late game luxuries. Regardless of how useful things like this can be to larger empires, I find that new players can find themselves in awkward situations where buildings feel like they are not in the player's best interest. Take for example a simple scenario where a player has one city that's producing 10 commerce per turn and has no buildings in it. The player has no expenses, so they can put the research slider to 100%, and it feels like they're teching at full speed and being super efficient. But then they build a library there since they know it will increase their science production by 50%, but they don't take into account the 1 gold per turn maintenance cost. So now at 100% research slider, they make 15 beakers instead of the 10 they used to, but their expenses have increased to 1 gold per turn, and they will eventually have to reduce their slider to 90% research to break even on gold. The city is still making 9 beakers per turn naturally, increased by 50% in the library, which rounds down to 13 beakers per turn, but the player probably isn't paying attention to exactly how many beakers they make each turn. So the only thing a new player sees is the fact that their research slider had to go down after they built a library. So then the new player decides to build a market, since that's what the pro video tutorials are telling people to do. And now they've just incurred another point of maintenance cost. The research slider has to go down from 90% to 80% to break even, and even though the basic gold production is being increased from 2 gold per turn to 3 gold per turn by the market for a net increase of 1 gold per turn, the thing the player is most likely to notice is the fact that their research slider just went down once again. That city is now making more research than it started with, making 1 gold per turn, and it now has the free happiness from the market effect to keep growing to larger sizes. But the only way you get to see these effects is if you zoom in on that particular city to count the actual beakers per turn and gold per turn it's producing. On the empire-wide scale, the player only notices the fact that their research slider had to go down from 100% to 80%, and you're given the distinct impression that you did something wrong, despite being mechanically in a better position. This leads us towards one of the most interesting logic checks in the entire game, and what I would argue is the leading factor that keeps players from getting better at Civilization 3. The way the UI was designed seems purposely built to encourage players into going the wrong direction. I already mentioned the fact that the encyclopedia doesn't tell you about the most important factor in the Republic government, leading players to view monarchy as a strictly better option. Then there's the fact that the starting government of despotism for the game doesn't have any easy links to right-click to the wiki article in order to learn about the despotism penalty to the early tile yields, so new players won't typically know that that's even a feature. There's the fact that building libraries will increase the total output of research that you make per turn, while decreasing the highest percentage you can keep the research slider on. And then there's the simple things like how whenever a city goes into open rebellion, the UI prompt asks if you'd like to zoom in on the city. This subconsciously encourages players to zoom in on the city, click one of the population points to turn them into an entertainer that provides a happy face, then get the positive reinforcement for this action the next turn when the city comes out of rebellion. What's the actual right answer to this situation? You go into the government screen and turn up the luxury slider by 10%, which equates to the same cost of around 1 currency per turn. Then you go into the city and have that population point work a tile, like a grassland with a mine and a road on it. You've still lost the 1 gold per turn from the tile from the luxury tax, but you're also making an extra 2 food per turn and 1 shield per turn by doing things this way instead of using the entertainer. And it's so stupidly easy to see how much the math favors the second option when you take things out of context. But all the new player ever sees when their city goes into riots is the prompt to zoom in and try to take care of things from the city screen. Even if you try to apply this argument to a larger type of empire with several cities at the same time, unless one city is wildly overpopulated compared to all your other options, the luxury slider is still typically the way to go since most of your cities are going to be close to the same population count anyways, and will need the happiness effects within the next couple of turns. What's another thing new players might not realize based on the UI? Worker roads. Your workers should never leave a tile without putting a road on it first, which comes in addition to the fact that you will eventually want a road on every single tile in your empire. This also comes as a contradiction to our modern conditioning since most people are brought up on the idea that roads should lead somewhere. Players are encouraged to road between cities to link your defensive forces and allow the widespread use of strategic resources, but there's a good chance that the player won't realize that roads add commerce to a tile unless someone tells you that's a thing. After all, like the Despotism Encyclopedia entry, there's no easy tech block for roads that will allow the player to directly read the article about them. So aesthetically, the player might think that the only reason you should road is to link cities and resources, when in most cases you want to road literally everything you can, since 1 free commerce on every single workable tile will certainly add up over the course of the game. Have I made my point yet? These tiny little tips and tricks can lead to substantial increases in player efficiency not because they're particularly hard to understand, but because the game actively leads you in the wrong direction. And this is what leads some players to believe that the lower difficulties are incredibly hard, while more experienced players start to challenge themselves with outrageous restrictions in order to make the game more difficult. The most popular of these variants includes the Always War option for the game, where you simply declare war on every civilization the first turn you meet them, and never accept peace. Or the 1 city challenge, where you can never own more than 1 city at a time. So considering the fact that the corruption mechanics encourage players to always make more and more cities, regardless of the decreasing effectiveness of those cities, it's hard to believe that a single capital could compete with the strength of an empire 20 times their size. But it does. While your enemies are all spending their population points on settlers to expand their borders, a single megacity can reach some impressive production levels very early in the game, and basically guarantee the fact that you're going to build most of the early game wonders ahead of your opponents. This compounds with the fact that these wonders will often give you increased happiness, allowing the city to grow even larger, increased yields which can make tiles more worthwhile in the city, increased culture that will expand your borders to snatch up a couple nearby resources that you wouldn't normally get to reach with your capital, and the handful of wonders that allow you to literally double your beaker production several times over and keep up with the larger empires. All of which works because the human player can not only play the role of a trade broker with all the other nations, but the inability of the AI to mount an effective war against you would routinely allow me to survive wars with computer players several times my size in any given game. A point which brings up the fact that I should probably start talking about the AI opponents in Civilization 3. To start off, the most defining part of the AI is the bonuses they get depending on which of the 8 difficulty settings you set for the game, between the easiest setting of Chieftain difficulty to the current hardest difficulty of Cid that was added during the Conquest expansion. I'll be ignoring the Cid difficulty for this critique because most players regard it as simply a meme difficulty that hampers the gameplay experience in a way that's hard to understand until you beat the game on at least the old hardest difficulty of Deity. Hence why I feel perfectly capable talking about the game from the perspective of someone that beat Deity and never even felt the need to go on to beat Cid. Regardless, on the Chieftain difficulty, the AI has the cost of every building, unit, and technology doubled on them, while the player has normal costs for those things. the player gets 4 free content citizens in each city, and the player gets a 800% attack bonus against barbarians, which are those weird white guys that run around as neutral characters during the beginning of the game. Pretty simple, but the most important effect is the fact that the AI produces things half as quickly as the player, giving humans a significant handicap to make some mistakes and still come out on top. On Regent, the fairest difficulty, everyone produces things and technologies at the same rate, and while there's still a 200% bonus against barbarians, the AI also gets a 30% trade discount with the other computer players. In this case, each city starts off with 2 content citizens, so players might start to pay attention to the happiness mechanics in a way that they didn't have to notice before. Next, I'll focus on the Emperor difficulty, which ironically many people view as the fairest difficulty since the AI is so bad at using any advantages to its own benefit. Here, each AI starts with 4 defensive units like Spearmen at the beginning of the game, 2 offensive units like Archers, an extra worker, 8 free unit support to start off with, and 2 extra unit support per city, a 3-turn or less anarchy phase when switching governments, a 50% bonus to trade between AI, and a 20% discount on every single unit, building, and technology. Meanwhile, the player now only has a 50% bonus versus barbarians, each city only gets 1 content citizen to start off with, and the optimal number of cities for corruption has been reduced by 20%. But wait, it gets even better. On Deity, the AI starts with 8 defensive units, 4 attack units, 1 extra settler, 2 extra workers, 16 base unit support, 4 unit support per city, a max anarchy of 2 turns, a 40% discount on all things, a 70% bonus to AI trade, while the human player has a 40% decrease on the amount of effective cities before corruption starts to ramp up. On top of this, the AI will start to dislike you more on the harder difficulties, making them likelier to go to war with you for even just the slightest grievance. So frankly, if a high difficulty AI finds you on the first turn of the game and decides to declare war on the human, you're just going to die. This doesn't happen often, but it does highlight the fact that the AI are given an overwhelming bonus to their early game when compared to the human, which will eventually start to even out over the course of time. See, the fact of the matter is that the Civilization 3 AI doesn't really know how to use the tools the game gives them. Regardless of the amount of free unit support the AI gets, they will still frequently bankrupt themselves by stocking up on hundreds of worthless units that will only get eaten up in the nearly endless wars the AI wage against one another. Add to this the fact that the AI will typically waste their time building pointless buildings like cathedrals and walls, and wonders they have no chance of finishing when they're like the 7th player to discover the tech. So there are ways to work around all of these bonuses that ultimately make the game feel like the human is playing something completely different from what the AI is doing. Before I start to trash talk the computer too much, the one thing I have to acknowledge is their willingness to trade in between the other nations, which will feel very different from your normal 4X. Every time someone learns a new tech, the entire world will quickly go through a brokerage system for that tech as they trade gold, strategic resources, luxuries, maps, workers, military alliances, and other technologies, just to try and keep up with the science race throughout the game. If you, the player, decide not to participate in the system, targeting key techs the AI usually leaves for later in order to trade them throughout the entirety of the game, you will simply get left behind. Even on the lower difficulty levels, if a human decides not to interact with the trading opportunities, I found that the AI would typically start out researching them by the early industrial era, simply because an AI that trades one tech to another AI for a tech of equal cost has already just doubled their research speed. And if you get into a situation where 3 to 4 nations are keeping up with the head of the tech race and trading on every single turn to make sure they're up to date, they are basically capable of researching 3 to 4 techs all within the same time it takes you to complete one technology. If you want to start playing Civ 3 competitively, you have to just accept the fact that you're going to be opening the diplomacy screen every 3 to 5 turns on average, which seems nearly obsessive compared to most other strategy games I've played. every new tech I earn, every new resource I get, and every spare penny I can save would always go back into buying more techs to just try and keep up with the AI, especially when you start to factor in their 40% discount on research costs at higher difficulties. Eventually, you will start to pick up some skills in the trading scene as you learn how to single out the one AI that has more techs than the other AI, trade for their best stuff, then sell it off to the other leaders in order to make back your investment in the monopoly tech. Added to this is the fact that the AI have this interesting feature where they will value a tech that less people have as more expensive than a tech that almost the whole world has. So the player will quickly develop a habit of checking the available deals with every leader at the same time before settling on the best one while the value of the tech is still the strongest. So what initially felt like an awkward situation where the AI forced me into trading far more often than I was used to, would later become one of the most important skills in my arsenal to keep up with the computer players that should statistically be stronger than my own nation. This would get even worse as you progress even further into the game, as the player's ability to keep up with the tech race will eventually get stalled. Once the AI have a 40% discount on everything in the game, or even the 60% discount on SID difficulty, then it's only a matter of time until you start to fall towards the back of the pack. In terms of trading, that means that the player won't have the option to trade the new technologies they earn for anything worthwhile after like the first 50 turns of the game or so. Instead, the meta for this situation encourages players to throw down the research slider to 0 and trade lump sum gold and gold per turn to the AI for techs, or an attempt to extort techs from the AI using espionage and war to your advantage. Yet again, this signifies another important change to the player's psyche as they start to climb the difficulty ladder, and suddenly the tactics that worked for the last 10 games just won't cut it anymore. Time and time again, I would become the tech leader on lower difficulty games and watch certain AI fall off the bandwagon and get stuck an entire era or two behind the general curve with no real chance of getting back into the game. So by the time the player finds themselves in that same exact situation, it can feel rather helpless, since you've likely already seen what happens to the AI when they fall behind, and maybe you just don't know that you can buy your way out of this situation with raw gold instead of research. But now that you've started to break into deity difficulty and even further, Civilization 3 requires the players use a different approach to the mechanics as you accept the fact that you will eventually fall behind. Of course, there are ways to mitigate how far you fall behind, as well as the minute chance that you will just randomly get some lucky rolls and keep up with the tech curve for some insane reason, but in most games, your sluggish pace will make you into the underdog at one point or another. As such, the hardest part that I found about deity difficulty was the fact that it felt like I was losing right up until the moment I snuck out the win. See, via the diplomacy win condition that only requires a player to get the majority vote by the other nations to win the game, humans can take some pretty backhanded victories against all odds. If you can slingshot yourself into the modern era and pick up the fission tech that you need to build the UN, a clean pre-build phase can give you a good chance to build a wonder the AI usually won't prioritize, and suddenly the game is yours to end. Even if the rest of the world doesn't like you very much, they just need to like you a little bit more than the other option, which you can also manipulate by signing military alliances against the largest nation in the world the turn before you finish the UN. And in the case that you don't finish the wonder first, the AI tends not to use it unless it's absolutely sure it will win, giving you enough time to build up a modern era strike force, go to war just for that one city holding the UN, and play out a heroic last stand while the deity nations pool their forces against the UN city while you wait out another chance to activate the wonder every 20 turns or so. A diplomatic victory isn't the most definitive sign of player power in a match, but instead represents the ability for the human to adapt around the win conditions in a way that the AI will basically never do. In most games where I did have the upper hand in both land percentage and a tech lead, it still remains easier to simply take an early diplomatic win instead of wasting the several hundred more turns it might take to finish off a space race victory, for example. After all, your name will show up in the same Hall of Fame regardless of which victory type you rode into the ending cinematics. But if this was supposed to represent the side of the game that I think the AI is good at, then what does the bad side look at? War. I put off talking about the military side of the game for the first half of the critique because I found that many people focus on combat as the only option for success instead of a tool to add to your repertoire. Simply put, I think it's important for less experienced players to understand that you can succeed at the game without letting it devolve into a bloodbath on every single playthrough. Too often have I read articles from journalists and new players that learn the wrong answers to the test and assume that war is the only path to success. Sure, you will benefit from having more landmass than your opponents, but sometimes turning that into an actual game-ending advantage can become complicated if you aren't familiar with your peacetime options. After all, the AI will be suffering less corruption in each city by default, capable of building more improvements in a shorter period of time, all the while speeding ahead through the tech race while you struggle to work up the troops you need to take care of your first enemy target. Of course, war is also really fun when you can run over that neighbor that stole the spot you really wanted to put a city on less than 40 turns into a game. And in the case that you do need to take out the UN city during a late game deity match, sometimes there just isn't another option. Thankfully, the military rules for the game more or less follow the same general structure of simple design, as everything revolves around just a couple of key characteristics. Every unit has 3 main stats, with attack power, defense power, and movement speed, with some of the more unique options later in the tree that inherit special perks that allow them to act differently. At its base, the CivIII combat works like a showman pulling random names from a hat. So if a unit with 6 attack attacks a unit with 4 defense, the game will throw 6 pieces of paper with the attacker's name on it into a hat, along with 4 pieces of paper with the defender's name, then draw them at random. The attacker thus has a 60% chance of winning each round of combat, while the defender has a 40% chance of winning each round, at which point one of the green pips on the loser's health bar will be lost. Both units will remain in combat until one of them comes out victorious and reduces the total health of the other unit to 0. Now, this system works good enough in most cases, although it does tend to produce some pretty strange outliers due to the random number generator that lies at the fulcrum. A spearman with 2 defense will still have a 11% chance to win a round of combat when attacked by a tank with 16 offense, which is enough of an issue that it's practically a meme in the CivIII community. It's hard to justify why this is happening from a strictly historical perspective, but I don't think that the Civ games are really targeting an accurate historical representation. Either way, the combat mechanics as I just described them also result in some weird problems of perceived lucky streaks. Nothing about drawing random names from a hat should cause unlikely results to happen several times in a row, since the theoretical pick is blind every time. However, we as the human observer for these battles in real time would tend to focus on the things that we find downright improbable, like said spearman defeating a tank. It's not impossible for this to happen by pure chance, but when the human psyche encounters and remembers several instances of things not siding in their favor, it starts to feel like the number generator is slightly skewed in a direction that produces several of the same results back to back. I think that a lot of this skew towards surprise results is caused by the fact that cities layer on another set of defensive bonuses that many players will not pay attention to. A city with 7 or more population will receive a 50% defensive bonus, while a metropolis with 13 pop will result in a 100% defensive bonus. On top of this, players can put a set of walls in their city for an early game 50% defensive bonus, or the civil defense building that provides a 50% defense bonus during the late game. So when we put said 2 defense spearmen in a metropolis with a civil defense building, their rating shoots up to 5 versus the tank's offensive score of 16, resulting in a 24% chance to win each round of combat. Otherwise, if you take the same scenario with a couple of units that are more likely to face off against one another, like musketmen with a defense of 4 and cavalry with an offense of 6, then the player still wanders into that battle fully expecting to win in most cases. Except that by this point in time, most cities will probably have a size of 7 or more, and the muskets are getting a 50% defensive bonus, turning the entire battle into an even match of 6 defense versus 6 offense. Then, if you start to attack an enemy city on fresh water with a higher population than 13, then the musket suddenly has a 100% bonus and the odds are now 8 defense versus 6 offense. But the player is still seeing a unit that they think has a defensive value of 4, instead of taking into account the effects that city size can have on a battle. So to them, when several calves end up dying to a single musket, which they perceive as an easy battle, it's much easier for the player to blame it on bad random number generators instead of accepting the fact that you didn't fully understand what you were about to walk into. I know that this is a true situation because it actually happened to me on one of my earlier games that forced me to learn the importance of defense bonuses at nearly any point in a match. Now, regardless of whether the random number generator actually is streaky, when the Civ team released the Conquests expansion in 2003, one of the minor features they added was a system to mitigate the chances of unlikely streaks. Instead of picking one name out of the hat and calling them the victor each round, the computer now picks a name out of the hat 4 times before declaring a victor for each set. Ties are thrown out, and a streak of bad luck that might have allowed the spearmen to totally destroy a tank will now only result in them winning a single round and doing 1 point of damage. In a theoretical best case scenario, this would keep the same victory chances as the base version, while also forcing the game away from unlikely results back to back to back. Except, that's a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? It shouldn't be possible to change the perceived results of random number generation without actually altering the statistics going on under the hood, and that's exactly what happened. For some reason, I really like this example of a spearman versus a tank, even though it almost never comes up in my own games since players shouldn't be using tanks. But anyways, the 2 defense spear used to have a 11% win chance for each round. But now that each point of damage requires 3 out of 4 dice rolls to confirm a result for every single round, basically requiring 3 or 4 instances of an 11% dice roll to happen back to back, which can be represented by a 0.1331% chance or a 0.014641% chance, respectively. So, if I wanted to further try and represent the chance of a spearman winning any individual battle against the tank, those numbers can get even harder to compute with the basic math that you learn in school. So, for this we're going to have to use something called a Bernoulli trial, which is represented by the equation I'm showing on screen. It looks kind of scary to read, but when you try and visualize it out loud, it can start to make a lot more sense. What the Bernoulli trial does is it takes every end result possible, then applies the normal percentage chance equations to it in order to come to the overall percentage chance. So for a standard Civ 3 battle, it's going to look something like this. The rules are simple. Both sides start with 3 health, so every battle will be decided one way or another after 5 rounds or less. The end scenarios in orange represent situations where the attacker wins, while the end scenarios in blue represent the defender winning. In the case that both sides are of equal power, both units have an equal chance to win, but things start to get interesting when we factor in the attack and defense stats. Based on the already known victory percentage for a spearman of 11% for each round against a tank, we can now compute the percentage chance of each result, which will look something like this. Pretty decent. We can see that the spear has an overall 1.12% chance of destroying a standard tank, while the tank will still win 98.88% of the time, as it probably should. But now that Conquest has introduced the 4 random numbers per round rule, we have to throw in another set of tables to represent this new sub-round. But I think there's something valuable to be learned from actually diving into the statistics on why the math checks out the way that it does, because it has some weird and interesting effects on the game. Given the fact that ties are thrown out, the spear will now win an individual round 0.52% of the time, compared to the tank that wins 99.48% of the time. Take this and throw our new percentage chance to win into the big graph to represent the overall battle, and the spear suddenly has a 0.00014% chance of defeating a standard full health tank. Take this same table and let's see what the cav versus musket battle looks like with a 68% win chance for the cav during the original battle system. But when we throw in these units into the new Conquest system, the individual round win rate for the cavalry goes up to 72.62%, and then the overall battle win rate also goes up to 86.9% of all combat between the standard 6 cav and 4 musket. Does this tend to eliminate streaks of surprising luck? Yes it does. The spear has a 99.999999% lower chance of defeating a tank compared to the old system. However, this also comes at the expense of player understanding. Taking the combat values of 2 units and comparing them is simple and easy to use. Taking those same combat values and trying to understand how they apply to a best of 5 tournament is a little bit harder. Taking those same combat values and their win percentage under a best of 5 tournament, with each round comprised of 4 mini matches with a no ties rule, is borderline impossible without pen and paper. Then you take the city defense bonuses that can completely turn the tides of any battle and make a sure win into a total loss. Civ 3 combat suddenly seems very complicated in ways that the game is almost never going to communicate to the player unless you look this information up on the internet. Instead, we get a cute little animation battle where the player gets emotionally attached to each and every round as you cheer for your team, completely unaware of the 4 sub-rounds that determine the winner of every visible point of damage. Thankfully, we can just choose to ignore all that if we want to. The way the math shakes out, by just looking at the raw stats of 2 units, this already gives us a good enough estimate of how the combat is going to play out. If your number is bigger than the enemy's number, you will typically have a better chance of winning, and while we can never assure any given victory, the player can always mitigate the risk by bringing more attackers than the defenders. This led to the rise of what most players refer to as doom stacks, which will represent dozens of units occupying the same square during the early game, and hundreds of units on the same square as you approach the endgame wars. Thankfully, the current complete Civ 3 version on Steam comes with a move stack function, which allows us to move all of these units with only a single click, which can help make managing doom stacks much easier to do in the late game. Similarly, as you start to get better at the game and tackle harder difficulties, it practically becomes a necessity to turn off movement and combat animations, otherwise you will spend literal minutes of your life every single turn just watching the AI parade armies across your territory, which is not very fun. But why do we choose to stack all our units onto a single square when we could just as easily spread them out to create a bigger zone of control? The answer lies in how the mechanics choose the best defender for each attack against a square. If both a swordsman with 3 attack and 1 defense, and a spear with 1 attack 2 defense are standing on the same square, then any attacker to that stack will have to battle the spearman first until he is either defeated or low enough health that the swordsman has a better chance of winning the defensive battle. So by stacking several units, this allows us to defend a large number of high attack troops with a low number of defensive troops, preventing the enemy from taking advantage of the attack focused units and their weakness. In addition to this, there exists another type of unit referred to as artillery that does not even have a defensive value, and as such they must be defended by other units while they are in the vicinity of the opponent. Otherwise they will simply transfer ownership over to the enemy if the enemy ever decides to send their forces to actually take that square. These artillery units have a unique purpose in that they have access to the bombard skill that allows them to conduct a single round of combat with the enemy unit without giving the defender a chance to hit back. As such, if the defender loses, the artillery piece may either take a pip of health away from them, or do some other more unique actions like reducing the population of a city or destroying certain improvements in a city, which can be especially useful when besieging the late game metropolis. During the early game, this ability can be pretty useful as you take a couple free points of health off the top unit in each stack, but it's limited by the fact that the early game bombard units cannot actually kill their target, instead only reducing them to a single pip of health. However, as you start to get into the industrial era bombard units like bombers and artillery pieces, then they will eventually unlock the ability to actually kill units, unlocking the true endgame for Civ 3 combat. Due to the simple fact that bombard units can damage a defender without putting the attacker at risk, quickly turns them into one of the most efficient military choices in the entire game, since you shouldn't really be at risk of losing these pieces unless you leave them in a really bad defensive position. Add to this the fact that the late game air units like bombers have a range of 10 tiles from any city you station them in, and suddenly every late game war is defined by stacks of hundreds upon hundreds of bombers that will absolutely demolish any city they come across. Unfortunately, this leads to the detriment of the tank unit, whose primary purpose is now relegated to simply walking into the undefended cities after all the defensive units got bombed out by your air units and artillery. But it wasn't always like this. Bombers were only given the ability to lethal bombard on the release of the Conquests expansion, turning them from a powerful unit into a game-ending unit that simply cannot be stopped when finally built en masse. But this also serves to highlight the fact that even some minor differences in the relative strength of units can have drastic effects on their overall utility in the game, leading to the situation where one or two units can absolutely define the nature of military power in each and every technological era. So while you might build up a couple of alternative options for niche situations like a lack of one resource or another, the ancient age is defined by a choice between either the swordsman or the horseman. The medieval era is defined by the early night rush or the later speed of cavalry units, while the industrial era is defined by the lethal bombard abilities on bombers and artillery. If you're going to war, you are going to be using one of these options in 99% of any scenarios, simply because they are the only point in a game where the attacker has a significant advantage against the defender, based upon all the statistical rules that I had to spend like 5 minutes explaining. To start, the strength of the swordsman is pretty easy to see at first glance, since it's the only unit in the ancient era with an attack value of 3 available to every nation in the game, compared to the best defensive unit in the ancient era, which happens to be a spearman with a defense of 2. Assuming everything else is held constant, this gives the swordsman a successful attack rate of 87% odds versus the spearman, which is a pretty good bet to take in any situation. Otherwise, you might also want to use a horseman, despite their attack value of 2, since they have access to the special trait for mounted units, which allows them to withdraw from combat. If at any point during a combat sequence the horseman seems to be losing, such as when the defender has more health left after a round than the horseman does, then they will withdraw from combat and are allowed to continue moving if they have any movement points left. So while this might not help the player win the battle, by conserving the total strength of their army and allowing these wounded units to heal back up to full strength, it gives the attacker the advantage in long-term wars, since they will lose fewer units to the pure chance of 2 attack versus 2 defense battles. These mounted attackers also benefit from a higher than average movement speed, which allows them to maintain better maneuverability and force the enemy into bad exchanges by positioning the horsemen on defensive terrain like mountains and attack the enemy on weak terrain like open fields. But of course, these units are both invalidated when the defender reaches pikemen at one of the earliest available techs in the medieval era, forcing the attackers to either lose their advantage or tech up to the next power units. These power units take the form of knights during the early medieval era, which functionally fill the same role as horsemen did in the ancient era. Since knights are 4 attack, they will have a slight advantage against the 3 defense pikemen, and an equal fight against the 4 defense musketmen, which comes slightly later down the tech tree. But of course, they still maintain the advantage of the withdrawal trait, which turns this into the same basic war that happened between the ancient horsemen and spearmen. Instead, what makes the knight a decent option is the fact that you can spend gold to upgrade any remaining horsemen you have into this unit, while later on you can upgrade these knights into the true powerhouse of the medieval era in the form of the cavalry unit. These 6 attack, 3 movement beasts of a military option are one of the most game-defining units in each and every match, since they take both the advantages of the swordsman and the horseman and put them together against the similar era defensive unit of musketmen. Cavalry maintain the same attacker's advantage of 87% win rates, while also having access to the wonderful troop preservation skill of the withdrawal trait. The one downside to using cavalry is the fact that they also come so late in the era, making the relative time that they're useful much shorter compared to the other power units. But once again, the cavalry mitigate their weaknesses by allowing you to upgrade your old knights into them for cash, as well as the supremely useful 3 movement speed on each cav unit, which helps get them to the front lines much faster than almost any other unit in the game. Even after you unlock the use of tanks, the 3 movement speed of cavalry can still be incredibly useful compared to the 2 movement industrial era unit that you would assume to be a better option at first glance. Meaning that even if you totally fail to take advantage of their attacking skill during the late medieval era, they will continue to be a useful part of any army even as you enter the modern tech era. Mind you, most games will never even make it into the modern era on account of how powerful these units are during the mid-game on anything but the hardest difficulties available. The one thing that might lead people to not use some iteration of these power units each game comes in the form of the unique units available to each nation. The Aztecs get a powered up warrior with 2 move speed instead of 1, which allows them to unleash some powerful early game rushes. The Greeks get a super spearman with a defense of 3 instead of 2, making them really hard to attack in any type of early game war, while the Egyptians get a super chariot with 2 attack instead of 1, making it a cheaper alternative to using horsemen for an early game rush. These units can vary from relatively bad options like the Russian Cossacks that make their cavalry more expensive to produce for very little gain, to some of the most overpowered units in the game like the Iroquois mounted warriors that are basically horsemen that get 3 attack instead of 2. Regardless, each player will feel motivated to use their related unique unit as a result of the Golden Age system that will trigger whenever the unique unit wins combat for the first time in a match. In many ways, triggering the Golden Age for each civilization is the most important aspect of the unique unit system, since a well-timed Golden Age can well and truly catapult your civilization ahead of the curve. During a Golden Age, every single citizen already producing at least 1 shield or commerce will then produce an additional shield or commerce for 20 turns, giving players the equivalent of the Republic government's most powerful trait for both commerce and production at the same time. Mind you, if a player times things poorly and activates their Golden Age while still in despotism, they're still going to lose at least one of those extra production points to the despotism penalty, which can ironically undermine the usefulness of many of the early game unique units like the before mentioned Jaguar warriors. Or in the case of more defensive unique units, players might be forced to goad their enemies into attacking a couple of cities in order to even trigger this oh so useful Golden Age in the first place. Of course, there is the alternative of using the wonders in the game to trigger your Golden Age, although that becomes a lot more complicated and difficult to do. See, every nation has a set of 2 traits between your options of industrial, commercial, scientific, expansionist, agricultural, militaristic, religious, and seafaring, which all give different bonuses that excel in certain areas and gameplay styles. For the militaristic nation, your military units have a higher chance to promote after each successful battle, giving them more pips of health and making them even more useful in the long term. While the scientific nation has the cost of libraries and universities reduced by half, as well as earning a free technology at the start of each era. Ultimately, the more competitive traits tend to be the ones that are useful in every situation, like the industrial trait, which increases your worker efficiency by 50%, allowing you to make more improvements faster than your enemies. Or the commercial trait that reduces the cost of markets by half, as well as starting with the technology alphabet, which happens to be one of the best early game trading techs that you can have. At the end of the day, each of these traits can be incredibly useful when used in the right manner by playing into their relative strengths, adding yet another factor to keep in the back of your mind on each game of Civ 3. But of course, they also provide a secondary chance to activate your golden age in each game if you can build a wonder or two with the same associated keywords as your civilization traits. Take for example the Colossus Wonder, which is described in the Civilopedia as commercial, expansionist, and seafaring, meaning that if the English build this wonder, they would immediately trigger a golden age since England is commercial and seafaring. Otherwise, if the militaristic and expansionist Zulu built the Colossus, they would also need a militaristic wonder like Leonardo's Workshop or the Great Wall in order to trigger their golden age, since both traits can be triggered by separate wonders. Obviously, most times it's easier to simply trigger a golden age by winning combat with your unique unit, but in certain cases like Abraham Lincoln of the Americas, it's unlikely that you'll ever have a chance to build his unique F-15 fighter jet near the end of the modern era, forcing players to try and earn a golden age through wonders alone. For a single-player game, this handicap for the American civilization can serve as a compelling challenge for the player to overcome, but people aren't just playing through Civ 3 alone. Over the course of the last couple decades, Civ 3 has had and continues to have a surprisingly active multiplayer fan base and online ladder system that attempts to match players up based on their skill and MMR. But instead of giving a summary of this multiplayer scene myself, I reached out to the #1 ranked player in the world named Suede, so that you can actually hear from an expert on the multiplayer scene about how Civ 3 has developed over time.
Hey everybody. So, let me tell you about a game. It lasts between 5 and 15 hours, but the winner may be clear hours before you reach the actual end. The starts are asymmetric, and some are vastly superior to others. You pick a faction at the start of the game, and some of those are vastly superior to the others. It has a heavy RNG component, it's kind of buggy, and a lot of the interesting features are unusably bad in a practical sense. So this game is Civ 3, and on paper it seems like the most awful godforsaken game that you could play against another human being. For single player, it's fine. If the game's going bad, you can just quit. But in multiplayer, you're forced to sit through an awful gaming experience because that's how the base game is designed. But for some reason, Civ 3 has one of the most dedicated and enduring multiplayer communities of any 4X game in history. So let's talk about why. What makes the multiplayer side of this game so notable that people still want to play it every day after all these years? Well, in my opinion, there are 3 factors. The first is that there simply aren't a lot of good turn-based multiplayer strategy games. And among the ones that do exist, very few of those are in the 4X genre. Like a lot of the other ones are like tactical strategy games. 4X is just a genre that is very hard to adapt in a multiplayer context, which is a shame because it also has the potential to be one of the funnest genres. Reason number 2 is Civ 3 does lend itself to being played with simultaneous moves with a turn timer quite well. You can just switch production in the middle of building anything, and all of your production, all your shields carry over. It's very forgiving. There are a ton of hotkeys, but there's also a slight delay on your commands, so other players can't pull any, like, 200 APM insane StarCraft unit micro shit. And the focus on stack combat means that you don't have to micromanage every single unit when you play Civ 3. All of this means that the game can be quite complex, but it's still manageable. You can still manage everything in your empire within a reasonable time frame. So the third reason, and this is the most important, is the unparalleled ways in which the game is moddable. The best thing that the developers in this game ever did was give us an extremely wide set of tools and let us figure out what worked best. Modding is also notoriously simple to do. You don't need XML coding, you don't need 3D rendering in proprietary formats. This is a massive advantage that Civ 3 has over Civ 4 and Civ 5. It is so easy to make scenarios for this game. And so, that's what people did. And as a result, all the flaws at the start of the speech were problems that the community chipped away at gradually. So there's a flaw that the game is too long and slow. We made it shorter and faster. The game drags and is inconclusive. We introduced city elimination and regicide. The game is imbalanced. We balanced it. People get bad starts. We stuck them on 4v4 teams to normalize those odds. Some features are just unusably bad. I'm looking at you, Modern Paratrooper and Cruise Missile. We made those usable. And the game is buggy, so we crafted and balanced the metagame and the scenarios themselves around these bugs just so the game is playable in the state that it exists if we can't get rid of the bugs. So, now that I've talked about what we've accomplished, let's talk about where we began. Civ 3 Play the World came out in 2002, and by all accounts, the multiplayer was a broken mess. Constant drops occurred due to out of syncs. The Conquest expansion followed in 2003. It still had issues with bugs and drops, but it was more stable, and had some features crafted with the multiplayer community in mind. Crucially, it was packaged with scenarios called Conquest scenarios. It's confusing, I know. So these were special scenarios with a custom map, custom assets, and new game rules, things like World War II in the Pacific, Napoleonic Europe, or Mesopotamia. And while these didn't have a lot of replayability in multiplayer games because the map is fixed, they did introduce a ton of assets and programmable game features to this already extremely easy to mod game. The features that were included in the game editor because of these scenarios formed a key part of the community-made mods that would become multiplayer staples. But the next part of the story isn't that mod work. People were still trying to sit down and play the game in its original state, albeit with accelerated production turned on. Now, that original state was quite bad, but there was a bigger problem I mentioned earlier that we have to return to. Remember when I said, in single player it's fine, if the game's going bad you can just quit? Well, quitting was a rampant problem in casual games when Civ 3 was released. So the community created a ranked ladder league. At first, this was just to prevent quitting, but it grew to become a major self-contained community with lots of competition, regular ladder tournaments called the Clan Challenge Cup, and of course, more work and thought put into how the game should be played, both from a gameplay perspective and from a scenario design perspective. So once the ladder started, people had to figure out what kind of mode to play. Eventually, the mode that's just like playing the regular game became known as Epic, because it is an epic experience. Long, inconclusive, it could last 5 to 10 hours easily. But people started to crave something else, although that was a popular game back in the day, 20 years ago I guess. Most of the initial scenarios were based on existing mods that came pre-installed with the game. So for example, there's a Future Start mod that just makes you start with all the text that came pre-packaged with Civ 3 Conquest. So people started playing that. QC. So it's called Quick Civ. If you look on your copy of Civ content, you don't need to download anything. It's already installed if you have the game installed. Because of that ease of access, it became very popular. So if you don't know, QC is a game mode where all the costs, it's basically 4 times as fast as the regular game. There's not many other changes aside from that, aside from the despotism penalty being removed, but mostly it's just a sped up version of the regular game. Oddly enough, it's still turned into like a long, because it allowed people to accelerate and build big so fast, it made the game slow in its own way, but at least allows you to reach deeper into the tech tree than playing the regular game might. Future, of course, in an ancient form, was popular back in the day. So eventually, the Future was slowly modded over time to become the scenario that we know and love today, but in that start, it was just, you literally start with all the text and that's it. So the meta was pretty messed up. You had things like some civs would have ancient unique units, so if you started as the Aztecs, you could just run your Jaguar Warrior at someone, and all the units that they could, like I think the Rifleman was the cheapest unit you could build if you didn't have a unique unit, so it was fucked up. Agricultural civs were overpowered. You could just rush people with mobile SAMs, because mobile SAMs have 1 attack and 2 movement, so if the enemy has no units yet, you can just walk into their undefended capital. There was this ridiculous strategy where you could build like a bunch of flax and a bunch of tiles, and like literally every tile in your empire you'd guard. It was just like a way to turtle and play defensive, because this was a free-for-all game, right? You just wanted to be left alone while you just build very slowly, but very safely. So yeah, the meta was messed up. Like I said, free-for-all was a bit problematic. And eventually other formats overtook it for latter games. Teamers, of course, like 4v4 games, were quite popular eventually. And they're still the dominant game form today. They are, yeah, the dominant game form today. But there's also this new mode called CTON, or CTON, or whatever you called it. So you might be wondering, what does CTON stand for? Especially if you played like Civ 4 or Civ 5. I've heard that this term is still used to this day. And people say that there's like a backronym. I think it's a backronym at least. They say cannot talk or negotiate. So that's like a description of what this mode is, right? It's just like you don't contact anyone. It's free for all in the sense that everybody fights everybody, but you don't do anything cheesy like making alliance and have everybody gang up on the weakest or the strongest player. So yeah, that's what they say. CTON stands for cannot talk or negotiate, but according to the Civ 3 community, if you ask other people, there was a player named CTON. So she was still playing when I played back in 2008. And she was the one who came up with the idea for this game format. And so that's why it's named after her. So throughout the 2000s, the multiplayer community stayed strong, even with the release of Civ 4. The Epic and the QC scenarios slowly fell out of favors, and some new mods sprang up. Future got patched a bunch. There was like a period of 4 or 5 years where everyone had their own version of Future. But eventually, one made by a Slovenian guy named Player XXCC became the standard Future that we know and love today. There was also the UU scenario, where each bonus or luxury resource unlocks a different unique unit. So for example, if you have iron and gold, you can build the Gallic Swordsman. If you have wines, you can build the Jaguar Warrior. So every Civ gets access to every unique unit. That was commonly played with teams or as a CTON. And there was MPT. So MPT took a bit to become what it is today, but it grew exponentially to dominate the multiplayer scene, at least for people interested in the ancient era. By the time I started playing around 2008, it was just like the dominant ancient scenario. So the way it works is just the map is very, very small. You have like a select roster of ancient era civs, and you play 4v4. It's very fast. Oh, there's one city elimination, so if you lose one city, you die. Very fast. People will just die like turn 10 or turn 15, and there's minimal change. Like, the only one at the time, I think, was that map trading was available at map making. Aside from that, it was unmodded. So, by the time I was playing ladder in the late 2000s, these were the mods that were popular. And MPT in particular was super popular, although there was like a big clique of people that would just they'd play Future all night. A game would end, another one would start. A game would end, another one would start. It was just constant. And I was pretty good back in the day. Future was my mod of choice. I played as much as I could. Enough to get accusations of being... That's how you know when you're good when you start out, that people will ask you like, you're too good to be a noob. You must have played before under a different name. I got accusations like that. But despite having a lot of fun with it and developing as a player to be a bit more talented, I had issues with internet conflict. So conflict was an issue when people played over the GameSpy servers. It made players unable to connect with particular other players, and that made it hard for me to find games, because like one player out of every 15 I just could not play a game with. I started playing again in the first year of university when my connection was a bit better, but my attention was split with StarCraft and League of Legends. StarCraft 2, sorry, new games that were coming out at the time. I changed my name a few times around then too. First from Capsule to horror, like the genre of movie, and then from horror to Suede, after the Britpop and glam rock group that I was super into at the time. But around mid-2011 I stopped playing, and so my take on history goes a bit dark for a bit. GameSpy shut down its servers in 2014, and then the Civ player ladders shut down too. So after 13 years, recorded Civ 3 and ranked Civ 3 was done. These were dark days for the community in a sense. There was no actual ladder, but people didn't descend into unwashed barbarism. People kept playing with the same people that they'd known for years. The people that they trusted, people that they knew played well and could make for competitive games, who liked the same mods that they did. The ladder still existed as a community of people, if not an actual institution, and in a lot of ways it didn't change much, but it changed enough. I rejoined the community at the end of 2014, and I remember being a bit horrified to discover that nobody played Future anymore. It was like I came back and I was greeted by... There was a Steam group, and there was 4 people online at the time, and they had a talk with me about what was the current state of the online game, and it was pretty grim. It was come and go. I managed to actually be part of like a mini revival of Future in early 2015. But that same year I finished my MA and I spent about a year unemployed and living with my parents, playing every single game I could find. And at that point, Future fell out of favor, or at least the Future players just stopped showing up, and the only people who were still around wanted to play QC. QC had taken over. Now, this was a bit of a turnaround, because QC was popular in the early days, and then MPT completely dominated among the ancient scene, but QC came back into popularity around that time, around 2015. So there's a specific reason for that, or a few specific reasons at least. So MPT, like I said, it's a particular map template that's very, very small, but it has to be played with 8 people, otherwise the map is too big and it's not as like dynamic and people die a lot. It's too turtley for most people's taste if you play with fewer than 8 people. It also just didn't work without the ladder. Like I said, you got Chasqui Scouts, you got MP, you got Jaguar Warriors running around. There's just a lot of risk of dying even 10 or 20 turns into the game. And so if you're against those civs, you have to play more respectfully, but when there's no ladder, there's nothing on the line, people don't play respectfully. They play greedy, and the metagame is different, and then the games just end abruptly if people decide to do something stupid, and they don't get punished for it. QC tended to favor that kind of play on your own, play very greedy type play style, and so QC became more dominant. It became more popular. Yeah, a good way to compare MPT would be like something like poker. Like imagine, have you ever tried playing like Texas Hold'em or something with no money on the line? If you do, like a challenge, like do it with like a family member or a friend and see how many times they fold. In like an actual competitive game of Hold'em with like 6 people, people will probably fold, like 80% of the time, 50% of the time. They'll almost never fold if there's no money on the line because they want to see where their cards take them, where their hand goes. They don't have that motivation to play well. And MPT is kind of like poker in that sense. So MPT fell out of favor, QC rose in popularity, and interest in Future was really fluctual. So I played QC at the time, that's all there was to play most days, and I absolutely broke the mod in half. It turns out like just something about the way that the mod was constructed mechanically means that if you play perfectly, you basically have superpowers. And I became very, very, very good at playing perfectly. I played 2 games a day, probably 4 hours or 5 hours every single day. Now, we've patched the mod since then, we've nerfed slaving, we made people spawn closer together so it's more scrappy and less buildy. The whole thing kind of played out, the whole thing is kind of played out, even though it's in its fixed version now. But I have a lot of nostalgia for that Wild West era of QC around 2015 and 2016. So, while we made good progress with modding and bringing back some older players, by 2018 it was apparent that there were just no new players joining the community. Like, I can count literally one player, Nat Maris, who was the only player who between 2015 and 2018 joined the community and actually stayed around. And it was clear that if we kept doing things the same way, eventually the number of active players would dwindle and there just wouldn't be a community anymore. So that's why I started a YouTube channel, and it's been quite successful at growing the community. A lot of the top 10 or top 20 players in the ladder now were not even alive when CivIII was released, to give it that kind of context. I guess I've spoiled things a bit, so let's talk about the cool things we've done in the past few years. We brought back the ladder, actually. There is a ladder website. If you look in the description of this video, I'm sure it will be linked there. The Clan Challenge Cup is back. We're having tournaments and a clan system. We actually had the first ever cash prize tournament. So you heard that right. People actually got paid real cash money to play Civilization 3. People stream now. People do voice comms. The community is actually in a lot of ways cooler than it ever was before. And it's still pretty damn active. And as I get more attuned to how the metagame works and what people find to be fun, I've grown bolder in how I do modding. Last year I introduced a completely new scenario named Modern. It's balls to the walls crazy, it's got custom units in Civilopedia, it has a whole new tech tree, 8 different resources, 4 unique governments with unique buildings and wonders. And it's the first mod that wasn't based on something pre-packaged. So most of the other mods before were based on mods that Firaxis had included with the initial release of Civ 3. And they went through this iterative process where it might have eventually became something that was unrecognizable from the initial version, but they were still based on that idea. This was the first mod that was just created from scratch from someone's imagination. It's not a mod based on what they gave us, it's just a mod based on community ideas and my experiences playing other mods. It's a meta mod. It's a mod entirely inspired by multiplayer mods. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many cool, uncharted possibilities in what you can do with the editor that we've only just begun to dip our toes in. I actually tried making another mod last year. It was based on the Age of Discovery conquest scenario. You can't take cities, you win through victory points from harvesting resources, building wonders, or from piracy. It had invisible ghost units. I could not balance this scenario to save my life, but oh my god, was it so fun to try. So that's the gist of it. There's a bunch of stuff I omitted, like there's this whole bizarro Russian civ community over on Hamachi. They merged with us at the end of 2018 or so. I couldn't cover everything, but if that sounds fun to all of you, come join us on the Discord. You can play or you can watch. There's a lot of fun things to do.
So for those of you that don't have prior experience watching the CivIII YouTube videos that Suede makes, you should probably check out his work at the link in the description below. After all, you basically can't find a better content creator for the game compared to the amazing series of Let's Plays, challenge games, and video tutorials that Suede has built around his intense and impressive knowledge of CivIII. But now that I have a subject matter expert that's covered the multiplayer aspects for the game, what else is there to talk about? Well, obviously, Suede mentioned several of the mods for the game like the Future Start mod and Quick Civ, which remain some of the most popular options for multiplayer. But it strikes me that many people might not know very much about the existing expansion packs for CivIII and exactly what they do for the game. The first expansion pack, named Play the World, released in 2002 and had its primary focus on the addition of multiplayer in the first place, although this initial iteration of the functionality was hampered by slow loading times and several bugs and desyncs which plagued the system. Ultimately, these problems would eventually be fixed over time in order to give us access to the incredible multiplayer scene that there is today, but the state that the function launched in was not one of CivIII's finest moments. Despite this, Play the World added several other features like 8 new civilizations, 2 new units, several new wonders, and 5 new win conditions that were specifically designed for the multiplayer game mode. These new victory conditions are technically available in the single-player mode for the game as well, but the focus on strategic factors like regicide, capture the princess, and victory point scoring provide a much more nuanced approach than the original rule set, while also encouraging combat in most scenarios. Perfect for the warfare-heavy multiplayer mode where all sides start on an even footing, but much less consistent for a single-player game against the deity AI. At least the regicide mechanic opens up some backdoor victory options, even in single player, to spice things up, so if there's one thing this brings to your average player, it's going to be the joy of king sniping and watching an entire nation self-destruct. Despite this, I would say that the most important addition that came from the Play the World expansion was the inclusion of the medieval infantry unit and the industrial era guerrilla unit, namely because they shake up the meta of attacking units throughout the game. On release, the choice between swordsmen and horsemen during the Ancient Age was an interesting one to make since they both came with different advantages. The swords were mathematically superior in battle, while the horses benefited from the withdrawal trait as well as the ability to upgrade into better units down the line, making the choice between the two a more consequential one. Swords represented a strong military push that would have diminishing returns over time, since in the base game you would not be able to upgrade them into anything useful as time went on. But that all changed with the introduction of the medieval infantry, a 4 attack, 2 defense, 1 move upgrade to the swordsman that comes in the early medieval era. Now that swordsmen have this upgrade path ahead of them, it acts like an extension of the relative power of the unit by allowing it to remain useful for most of the expansionist phase of the game. Sure, they are slightly less useful than the swordsmen, since 4 attack versus 3 defense pikemen is not as mathematically broken as the old 3 versus 2 battle, but it's still an advantage against the defender, which is often enough when you have 10 medieval infantry pouring into a city. Likewise, since the unit is tied to the feudalism tech, it means that the player isn't really going out of their way to spend time investing into a long-term worthless tech like the chivalry and military tradition techs that unlock the relative horse units. You don't need cavalry to unlock the industrial era, but everyone will have access to medieval infantry by the time they reach the next era, turning it into practically a free pickup as you try to keep up with the general tech pace. The only downside to this all is the fact that they will later upgrade into the close to worthless guerrilla unit that unlocks halfway through the industrial era. This 6 attack, 6 defense, 1 movement guerrilla unit unlocks at the same time as the incredible 6 attack, 10 defense infantry unit, as well as the first late game artillery unit with lethal bombardment. So the only real advantage a player might find in the guerrilla is the fact that they don't require any of the late game strategic resources like rubber or saltpeter in order to build, while having a slightly better attack value than a traditional rifleman. It's a situationally useful defensive option at best, and a hopelessly outmatched attacking unit at its worst, meaning that the swordsman line still does maintain a shadow of its old strengths and weaknesses. Building into swordsman still holds a place as an early game powerhouse, which will start to become less and less useful over the course of the game, while these new upgrade paths for the unit only serve to delay the inevitable when it comes to their late game purpose. Alternatively, the Horseman line has now cemented itself as the late game play, since their upgrade path will at least leave you with some number of cavalry units, which will continue to be one of the fastest units in the game, no matter how far down the tech tree you get. So while some critics of the Play the World expansion believe that the addition of medieval infantry muddy the balance of the game, I come from the perspective that their addition helps to highlight the relative strengths of both options. So if a first-time player chooses to invest into swordsmen without knowing that they can't upgrade into anything while playing the base game, they're just going to be straight out of luck. While in this new tech system, the medieval infantry might just give them enough time to make some type of good out of their investment into this dead-end military line, so at least it's a bit more user-friendly as well. Otherwise, the addition of wonders like longevity are relatively fun to play around with, but nothing that really shakes up the balance for the game in quite the same way as the introduction of a longer swordsman line. With that being said, Play the World was mostly focused around the introduction of a multiplayer game mode, but when that failed to go to plan, the expansion as a whole seems relatively uninteresting if you are just looking at the other additions to the game. Now, the next expansion by the name of Conquests in 2003 took these problems to heart and doubled down on everything they could. 7 new civilizations, 2 new civ traits, 5 new wonders, 2 new governments, 4 new bonus resources, 2 new terrain pieces, rebalancing the stats on 25 units, as well as implementing the new 4 sub-round combat system, an entire subsection of thematic scenarios to play through, and an overhaul to the back end of the multiplayer system to limit the problems with bugs and desyncs. In many ways, this was meant as the be-all and end-all expansion for the game, and for the most part, it was a total success. The introduction of 2 new civ traits in agricultural and seafaring made significant changes to the relative strength of each nation. The addition of marshlands and volcanoes provides some more terrain features for players to work around, and the evolution of the combat system was almost unanimously supported despite the relatively shaky mathematical basis as we talked about earlier. These were exactly the type of additions that people wanted to see from the game, and for the most part, it seemed like Conquest was simply focused on giving players more options of every type to explore. But with new options comes another evolution to the meta that left some of the most avid Civ fans waiting in the dust. The best explanation for this is the fact that Conquests wasn't actually built by the main team that put together the base game, but was instead offloaded into another company called Breakaway Games, while Firaxis continued to work on Civilization 4. What's notable about Breakaway Games is the fact that they specialized in building expansions on already well-received games like the Cleopatra expansion for Pharaoh, the Paradise Island expansion for Tropico, Emperor, Rise of the Mill Kingdoms, and later the Rise of the Witch King expansion for Battle of Middle-earth 2. So this is obviously a team of people that excel at taking an existing piece of work and adapting and growing on its gameplay in new and interesting ways. But when you offload an expansion pack the size of Conquests to another company, it can result in some genuine conflicts of interest between the design philosophy of both developers, such as in the case of Lethal Air Bombardment in Civ 3. I keep bringing up this tiny little change to the game because in a lot of ways it represents the strengths and weaknesses of Civ 3 on the whole. The difference between airplanes reducing their target's health to 0 instead of 1 seems unimportant, and yet it changes everything. Just like half of the seemingly unimportant features of the game, like the Republic bonus to commerce, which can have some enormous ramifications when you multiply that effect by 100 different interactions. On its own, the difference between one bomber having lethal bombard and another that doesn't isn't a big deal. It's unlikely that one bomber on its own will ever have a chance to outright kill another unit, but what if there's 10 bombers, or 50, or 100, or 200? These aren't theoretical numbers, since even a fairly inefficient player like myself can easily build up a doom stack this tall within 50 turns if they really want to. And now that this stack of bombers is not only necessary to reduce the defensive strength of late-game Metropolis, but now is capable of outright conquering enemy territory and destroying the defenders, the game is changed. Fundamentally different in an even more drastic way than what happened with the introduction of the medieval infantry, only in this case it wasn't the expansion of a player's options, but a reduction to the most efficient solution that changed things. The old industrial combat model encouraged a mixed force of units to take cities. Bombers represented a strong centralized bombard unit that could help lower the defenses of cities but not take them outright. The artillery pieces were then slow-moving, vulnerable targets for the enemy that would pay for themselves if you could defend them long enough to take advantage of their lethal bombard for the first time in the game. Then the tanks could make use of their blitz trait to attack the weakened city defenders multiple times in a single turn in order to best utilize the short window of opportunity created by all the bombard units. Finally, the cheap infantry defensive units provided the backbone necessary to cover the weaknesses of the attack-focused tanks as well as the defenseless airbase-style cities, altogether creating a surprisingly deep balance of military focus that extends even into the future age due to the relatively expensive nature of the original lethal bombard air units. Exactly the type of balance that rewards heavy micromanagement, a good sense of relative power, unit positioning playing into your strengths while mitigating weaknesses, and a wide range of strategic resources necessary to get the ball rolling. But under the new system, oil is king. You find a source of oil, you backstab your neighbors to get access to it, you build a stack of 100 bombers and a single tank to actually take the cities, and you win. No artillery necessary because they no longer have the relative strength of lethal bombard over your bombers. Hardly a need for tanks since they will always be slower than your 10 range bombers, and maybe a couple of infantry to guard your back ranks from sneak attack, but the most efficient choice, the right choice, the winning choice, is a stack of bombers. Pan the camera into a position where it won't move and spam the B hotkey to bombard the enemy cities one after another. Then move that random flak unit that you have nearby into the empty city for an easy win. But how did we get to this point? Probably because when you try and compare a single bomber with lethal bombard versus one without lethal, and they look functionally the same, until they suddenly are not. Mind you, I don't necessarily think this is the worst thing in the world, since it does a lot of good to simplify the game for less dedicated players like myself, but that's also the same justification that many games use for the casualization of their game systems. So while I enjoyed the profits of an unbalanced combat system, the veteran who put in the time to understand, learn, and balance the old combat system were inevitably disappointed by this change, and something that was once great was lost to time. But this wasn't the only questionable balance change that came from Conquests, oh no. The other major addition was the inclusion of 2 different wonders that would produce a free unit every 5 turns, the Statue of Zeus and the Knights Templar. These units weren't simply run-of-the-mill options either, but instead a 3 attack, 2 defense, 2 move horsemen with an extra pip of health no matter what experience level they start with, all of which while we're still in the ancient era. So if you throw the Statue of Zeus wonder into a city with a barracks and suddenly it's building superpowered swordsmen with 5 health points, the same defense as spearmen, 2 movement speed, the withdrawal trait, all while appearing completely for free every 5 turns until you unlock one of the last techs in the medieval era several hundred turns later? That's kind of cool, let's be honest, and it's fun to play around with, especially since the AI really doesn't seem to understand how to take advantage of this wonder at its full capacity, but that doesn't mean it's balanced. If you manage to build the Statue of Zeus, one of your neighbors will die. Between the sheer power of these units, their lack of shield cost, the amount of time you get access to them, and the fact the opportunity cost is so low to build this wonder means that the player will win a single war against basically any difficulty AI as long as this wonder is in their pocket. Of course, the wonder also requires ivory in order to build it, but that only makes it feel more overpowered since luxury resources like ivory are usually centralized at a single point, so only one player per game is going to have a chance to snag this beast of an ancient wonder. It's practically a free win button in most circumstances where you spawn near ivory, but the player once again needs to know that this is an option, otherwise they probably won't try it out. Unless you read through the Civilopedia to find out exactly what type of unit the Statue of Zeus creates, you won't realize what this is capable of. If you don't have a firm grasp of the combat math, 3 attack, 2 defense might not seem like a big deal. Unless you have the experience fighting large-scale wars, the 2 movement only seems like a mild improvement over 1 movement speed units. Unless you search through the entire tech tree, you might not realize that the expiration date on the wonder can be postponed for several hundred turns. Unless you do some back-end math, it might seem like a waste of shields to invest into a wonder that will eventually give you units instead of just building units in the first place. It is yet another trap, a mind swamp for new players that don't yet have the full context of experience to figure out exactly what is good and what is bad to pursue. Because for all of the amazing game-breaking things to invest in, like the Republic government or the Great Library or a stack of bombers, there's just as many traps that are practically worthless for the player, like the Great Lighthouse or the Mausoleum of Mausolos, that are only worthwhile in very particular circumstances. And how is the new player supposed to figure out whether the Statue of Zeus is worth building when compared to the Great Oracle or Leonardo's Workshop? Either you have to be a big brain strategy gamer, or you hear about it from somebody else online that has put in the time to do some math and figure out what is and isn't good. The new agricultural civ trait, incredibly good for almost every game. The new seafaring trait, incredibly situational even at the best of times. Both incredibly important additions to the game, yet both incredibly flawed in the relative strength of each option. The 2 new governments are also quite situational, since they are practically worthless for most games. The 4 new bonus resources are flavor text, the 2 new terrain pieces like marsh and volcanoes are meant to be played around and not interacted with. The wonders range from game-breaking to mildly situational. The rebalancing of old units led to unintentional results, and the rebalancing of combat makes a traditional numbers comparison feel bizarre and hard to read. And yet, I love this game. I love the fact that they added the great scientist leader that can either rush a wonder for free or start a fake golden age that actually hurts the player in the long term. I love the fact that the barbarians in the game run on a simple AI that can allow you to force them to attack into disadvantage whenever you want. I love the fact that chopping trees provides shields to a city, but only in very specific circumstances that the player can then manipulate in order to give those shields to a different city which is further away. And most of all, I love the fact that this game can start a player with a 20-to-1 disadvantage against the Civ difficulty AI, and the human player still has a chance to succeed through sheer determination and skill. Civ 3 is not balanced. Not in the slightest, nor does it even seem to try and do so. Instead, it is woefully and cripplingly gamey in a way that I think appeals to a certain type of gamer like myself, where learning is actually just half the fun. And perhaps the best example of this fact are the new Conquest scenarios. They commodify this gamey factor into an even more concentrated set of 10 situations across the span of history. Take over the Native Americans or the European explorers during the Mesoamerican era, or take up the reigns of the ancient civilizations as you try to expand across the entirety of the old world. Or build up victory points by building the wonders of that world. These things sound uninteresting until you realize that Civ 3 actually went to the trouble of developing a full set of different technologies to unlock over the course of each of these mini campaigns. Even more impressive is that each scenario seems to have a completely different set of highly tailored techs, so not only did they change the tech tree once, but every single scenario is going to give you a very different feel for the game than the base settings. For the Mesoamericans, this means that the native races have a chance to build super wonders that build up culture faster than anything else in the game. Or the even more ambitious tech tree during the Japanese conquests, where the techs are divided up along 4 separate eras, along with its own catalog of units that vary from the 1-1 swordsman to a 14-14 samurai as you reach the end of the match. What's funny about this is the fact that most of the Japanese unit designs are actually leftover artwork that was added to the game back during Play the World, but was never used for anything in the actual gameplay during the last expansion. So for any player that only chose to purchase the Conquest expansion and not Play the World, they would theoretically have to download a mod pack with the unit designs before they could even start the Senpuku scenario for the Japanese War of Iron. Regardless, this made the Senpuku Conquest one of the most interesting ones on the roster, since it truly did make the game feel like an almost entirely different experience. New units, new buildings, new technologies, new wonders, everything was mostly just a retexturing of the old options from the base game, but still tweaked just enough to shake up the general flow and balance of the match. So as I marched into these Conquest scenarios following my first win against the deity AI, I was more than prepared to flex my game knowledge and see how well the basic theories adjusted to different circumstances. The results of which felt like the Conquest scenarios are wildly skewed into the favor of the human player. The varied new gameplay options notwithstanding, each scenario also comes with a time limit between 50 to 200 turns long, yet also has an option to fulfill the alternate win condition, which is going to be much faster than your typical victory conditions. Sometimes this takes the form of victory points that encourage a specific type of play, like the Wonders of the World scenario that awards points based on the number of shields spent on these great works. Or in the Mesoamerican scenario, it introduces an alternate way to build culture by sacrificing captured workers in a blood ritual that awards large sums of culture for each death. These things aren't particularly groundbreaking compared to the new technology tree, but they do certainly require the player to adjust the way they approach each conquest in respect to the often very specific win conditions. Yet, this is also where I think the AI begins to fail in these scenarios, as they struggle to focus on the actual things that lead to victory instead of just playing the game as they were normally programmed to. Sure, if you set the difficulty to demigod or deity on these maps, the AI would typically out-expand me, outbuild me, and out-tech me, as is natural, but the alternate victory condition never really requires that type of play from the player. Focus on building some wonders during the Mesoamerican scenario, then use your unique units to earn some free workers off of the barbarian camps, and maybe even steal some workers from the AI with a last-minute suicide war as the match comes to a close. And I was at the bottom of the pile even as the last few turns rounded down, watching the AI eat up my cities one at a time while I ferried slave workers back to my capital, and still, I eventually won. It was relatively easy to win the scenario compared to the basic gameplay, since the AI could only really compete when it came to score and demographics, but never with a true sense of intelligence. So the very tenacity that turned them into a worthy opponent during the base game was the same thing that left the AI nearly senseless when it came to a more specific set of goals like these scenarios. Regardless, I enjoyed my time spent on the conquests, completing a fair number of them as they took between 1 to 4 hours depending on how focused I was on the action. The World War II scenario in particular was really fun to work my way through, as it seemed to focus on the combined arms nature of industrial warfare. The scenario forces each party into open war far too quickly for you to build up a useful stack of airplanes and utilize the typical conquest strategy of mass bombers. So instead, I had to build up a force of artillery pieces for bombard power, machine guns for defense, combat engineers to attack, and a couple light tanks to fill in the blanks where they were needed, building railroads in the background to try and maintain a better connected defense, and I took the reins of the Chinese nation as they weathered the storm from a never-ending Japanese attack. And it was fun. This was a different side of Civ 3 than anything I had ever seen during the actual main game mode, and while the scenario only lasted 50 turns, in real time that ended up spanning several hours of my life micromanaging these armies to the best of my ability, merely by holding my ground as the other allied nations took the fight to the Japanese allowed us to win the game, and I felt well and truly accomplished. But to be honest, I've never heard someone really talk about the additional scenarios available in the Civilization series. Sure, it was popular enough that the feature ended up making its way into every game following this point in time, but you're not going to hear an IGN review talk about the fun new features available in the scenarios section. It's a side attraction first and foremost that will obviously provide some fun for a couple of hours, but you're not going to be buying the game in order to specifically play the Sengoku scenario. So while I probably spent an extra 10 to 20 hours exploring some of the conquests that I found most interesting, it was never truly meant to be the primary focus of Civilization 3, and the restrictive time limits and map layouts make this quickly self-evident. Instead, the series as a whole has chosen to focus on telling stories about the various nations in a bit of a jumbled up random number generator type of way. From the hard-coded tendency for Gandhi to favor using nuclear weapons, to the fact that the Germans basically hate my guts every time I spawn as their neighbors, it's easy to get swept up in all of the tiny stories that are told over the course of each and every single match. So when Pachacuti of the Incans ended up spawning in nearly every single game I played for a week straight, and typically became my closest competitor, it suddenly felt like I had a rival to compete against. It was just a weird coincidence that they kept ending up in my games, as well as the circumstance that I felt a sense of competition with the nation, a unique set of situations that probably won't occur for most other players, but it certainly felt real to me. And in many ways, there's something really fun about taking these abstract nations, putting them on a map, and seeing who wins at the end of the day. Like how I can tell you stories about how the French invaded a weaker Zulu nation, but the Zulu were able to use diplomacy to get the rest of the continent to go to war with the French aggressors. It's weird, and it's wacky, and most certainly never happened in real life, but that didn't stop it from sticking in my mind as one of the most memorable moments in my 100 hours of play. And maybe these situations are elevated by the uncanny caricatures that the game tries to pass off as the civilization heads. The fact that both these character models as well as your advisors evolve over time to reflect the technological era that you are currently in. Or how the game implements a funny little palace minigame where you can slowly build up your imperial housing over time using different building blocks from every culture in the game. These things don't affect any part of the gameplay. They don't make me stronger, or smarter, or more powerful than my opponents, and yet I appreciate them in spite of their lack of purpose. This is the flavor text that draws out the stories in our minds and made it so easy for me to develop a true hatred for Pachacuti of the Incans. It wasn't just that he was my neighbor and made life difficult, but also the fact that I had to stare at this disappointed face for half of each game that looks like I killed his puppy for some reason. Meanwhile, the character animations for each of these leaders are so distinctive that I can bring up a mental image of each person as soon as I hear the name of their nation spoken out loud. And I think that there's something special about this attention to detail, since I can't really call it graphic fidelity. The character heads aren't particularly impressive from a modern standpoint, but they still remain surprisingly distinctive in their design, which leads itself to my long-standing memory of the caricatures. Just like the fact that the palace design feature stands out as something that I loved as a kid due to the simple joys of feeling like you achieved something of worth. Will I finish off the palace by the time the match finishes? When I do, it feels like an accomplishment, keeping my people happy enough to reward the different parts over time, and when I fail to complete the palace in time, it hardly matters since it never affected the gameplay in the first place. The lack of this final achievement hardly registers in my mind while distracted by the victory screen and the Hall of Fame, so I think it's pretty easy to discount this all as worthless fluff in the grand scheme of things, and by the tail end of 100 hours, I started to find myself skipping through the palace screen just to get back to the action. But these were also the things that were going to help draw newer players into the fold and keep their attention just long enough for them to realize just what kind of game is lurking beneath the surface of the UI. Sometimes it feels like that's what Civ 3 is trying to do, as the true depth of this strategic masterpiece lies hidden beneath the marsh that looks like it might only be a few feet deep at first glance. For some people, this might even be a good thing. You can certainly play through a couple matches on Civ 3 on the easier difficulties, fully unaware of the monsters dwelling below the surface. Just build the units you want to build, watch your nation get bigger, and enjoy the animated battles between yourself and the enemy. Or, if you want to break through the surface of the water and start diving even deeper, there exists an entire shipwreck of half-baked ideas and game concepts to explore far below the surface, most of which is never explained in any great sense of detail by the game itself, but instead encourages players to read through the forums and develop a sense of community for Civilization 3. Those players that truly get invested into learning the different systems of play then congregate into playing groups and succession games where each person goes in rounds playing through 10 to 20 turns of a match before handing it off to the next player in line. Not to mention the Realms Beyond epics and Game of the Month series that task community members to complete restrictive challenges on single-player maps, then compare their score with the other competitors that were also able to finish the victory conditions. So it's easy to see how many players that invest the initial 100 hours or so it takes to figure out the game will often turn that into 500 or 1,000 hours as they also get sucked into the larger community and storytelling that goes on over time. Namely, it's this storytelling style of ultra in-depth game analysis for Civ 3 and Civ 4 challenge maps that probably turned me into the type of critic that I am today. I distinctly remember spending entire weekends as a middle schooler just opening the website to Sula's Game Chronicles and reading about everything he's done. The mechanics confused me at the time, but the images of grand empires drew me in, while the genuine passion that Sula felt for the game shines bright on each and every page of his many journals of succession games and competitions. So as I finally start to grow up and find myself returning to Civilization III to take on this grand journey for myself and find the love that I had read about so many years ago, it strikes me as a certain type of beauty to the cycle of things. I am now in the place where my younger self used to look up to with respect and awe, telling stories in a similar manner to Sula, yet using a different medium. The message is still the same. To me, video games are an art form that expresses itself through numbers and math and ledgers and systems. A balancing act that places the player in full control of their actions and consequences in a way that is much harder to try and quantify in real life. So for a player such as myself, Civilization III represents the mechanical reduction of these concepts into a simple and easy to use format, because Civ 3 is not truly complex. It is simply obtuse in its explanation of the rules. It is not difficult, but rather encourages the player to rely on persistence in the face of adversity. And it certainly is not graphically impressive by any standard, yet what they have done catches the eye and screams out with all the artistic charm and flavor that makes the game unforgettable, even in 2021. I might enjoy and appreciate modern games for what they bring to the table, and yet this old beater of a car from 2001 is still able to spark the flames of passion in my heart. But maybe I'm just getting a little too sentimental over here. Civ 3 has flaws, and Civ 3 has its payoffs that allow me to look past those flaws and appreciate the journey. So, if you want to follow along on any other journeys that I take in the future, leave a like and subscribe as I continue to make in-depth game critiques in a similar style to this. As of right now, my future projects are looking like a possible video on the Stronghold series, Monster Hunter Rise, and Evil Genius 2, although only time will tell which one of those draws me in close enough to keep my attention. But of course, I have to thank Suede once again for doing a collab on this piece, since he is well and truly a creator that I respect for not only his videos about Civilization 3, but also his place in developing the modern multiplayer scene into what it is today. So go check out a link to his channel in the description below, as well as a link to Sula's website where you can read about all those wacky stories that I just mentioned earlier. Other than that, I hope you had a good time listening along, and maybe I'll see you again on another day, week, or month. Thanks for watching. Bye. I've just mentioned governments as in mine. What the fuck am I doing? You will only earn 2 food for working that tile. Okay. Of course, Republic gets Republic gets rid motherfucker 80% of the tiles in your empire. While most water tiles are in most cases you're just straight up better off sticking with Republic. Likewise, the granary can pay off. Likewise. Okay. It's getting late. 2 offensive units, like archers, and extra warrant, and the player will quickly develop a habit of checking the available deals with every leader at the same time. This would get even worse as you Instead, the meta for the if you can sling a wonder the AI usually don't priority. Oh god, I'm a dragon. Will result in a 100% defensive bonus. The computer now picks a name how to start. The strength of this to start oh god. To start, the strength of the swordsman is pretty. So while this might not help the player win the battle by conserving the total strength of their army and allowing these, oh my god, what was that? Plus tech like the chivalry and military tradition techs that regardless, this made the Seppuku conquest one of the most buying the game in order to specifically play the Sengoku scenario, and all the tiny stories that were told over the course of each and every. Ew. Gross.